For the past 85 years, the polling agency Gallup has been asking people what they think the most important issue in the United States is. They leave this open-ended and then they cluster their responses, which might reveal some biases of the people that cluster the responses, but ideally, these are biases that are shared by the broader American public. I thought it'd be interesting to go through some of these. In the middle of the Great Depression, at least this was the period in the 20th century that had the highest unemployment levels not reached since this year, actually, or until this year, actually. Top issues that people rated were budget and the unemployment. This was a time when Hitler was gobbling up parts of Europe near Germany. And so keeping out of war was the biggest foreign policy issue. But then Social Security, democracy, and dissatisfaction with government were the biggest domestic issues. By 1941, before the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th, there was a world war, and Americans, weary of getting into another European conflict, were very adamant that they wanted to stay out of the war. In fact, Franklin Delano Roosevelt had been reelected to an unprecedented third term, largely on this false promise that he would help keep the United States out of a war. There was also some issues with labor problems and cost of living. In 1945, after the war ended, or at least the victory in Europe, there was some worry about making their lasting peace, the economy in general, jobs for the men that had gone off to war. Those were large issues. 1949, the Soviet Union had just developed their first nuclear weapon. And so this is the middle of the Cold War, the beginning of the Cold War. Communism was a threat, and the biggest economic issue was inflation, cost of living. Housing was hitting a crunch for the first time, and so the development of Levittowns, what you might now know as suburbs, was key. 1954, during the height of the Red Scare, when Eisenhower was a president, communism was what was concerning most people. Unemployment, cost of living, and the Soviet Union remained as other issues. In foreign policy, the Soviet Union, world peace and nuclear arms, and foreign relations divided up the concern. This changed right after Sputnik, in which there was some concerns about war, Soviet Union, nuclear arms, but at the same time, there was a bus boycotts. There was some, Emmett Till had just been murdered 2 years before. There were some concerns about domestic issues, and again, inflation, cost of living. So the year after Sputnik, space program starts, and civil rights and education are dominating domestic issues. The economy in general seems to, people have just accepted that as a one big broad issue. And then keeping the peace and national security. In the 60s, we start seeing civil rights and race relations become just a mainstay. They popped up in the 50s, but now they were one of the top issues domestically. But unemployment and economic issues dominated economic thought. And in this period, 1 year into John F. Kennedy's tenure, communism, the Soviet Union, threat of war, and foreign relations were dominating foreign policy. Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963. Lyndon Johnson in 1964 and 65 passed the Voting and Civil Rights Acts. And so the largest issues domestically were civil rights and race relations. Internationally, the Vietnam War and communism and wars in general, those were dominant views that really were the central focus of Johnson's presidency. Same at the end of his presidency, at the beginning of the Nixon administration, you'll see that even though we landed on the moon at this point, the space program isn't the top concern of anybody. In fact, it had stopped being a concern nearly a decade ago. But the Vietnam War and civil rights and race relations were drawing all of everybody's attention. On the other side, youth protests, religious and moral decline, crime, those were all concerns. We'll come back to some of these in the health section of the class. You'll notice we've been going 34 years so far, and the environment hasn't shown up once. Nobody has ever thought to be concerned about environmental issues of any sort. By 1973, Nixon's second term, environment starts showing up as an issue of concern for 1 or 2% of the population. This was 3 years after the EPA was formed, nearly a decade after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published. And this was a time period in which environmentalists had become well known, had become their own movement. But they're still vastly outpaced by issues like drugs and crime, cost of living, the Vietnam War, civil rights and race relations. Environment just didn't make the cut beyond those, and in fact disappears entirely the very next year. Cost of living, there's some international oil issues at this moment that are happening, so that was driving up a lot of concerns about cost of living. In Jimmy Carter's presidency, at the beginning of it, inflation, unemployment, and energy are the biggest economic issues, but environment pops up again. So it seems like when we have some issues to worry about, but not overwhelming issues, environment has started becoming a mainstay. But it disappears again at the very beginning of Ronald Reagan's presidency, inflation and cost of living. It doesn't come back in his second term. Instead, fear of war, unemployment, the budget are driving people's concerns. It's not until the beginning of George H.W. Bush's presidency that the environment comes up again. This was a time period where people were particularly concerned about drugs. The Reagan administration had been pushing this war on drugs pretty profoundly. They had been pushing for 3 strike laws and for things that essentially made a generation of people, largely Black and Latino, go to jail. The statistics of this are pretty atrocious. It's as many as 1 in 3 African-American men age 18 to 49, a certain time period, were spending time in jail or prison. Economic issues, poverty, crime. The Reagan administration tried to link drug to crime issues. In the 1980s, were the high watermark for crime in the United States, although largely we categorize a lot of drug crimes as crimes. Crime starts declining for reasons that sociologists still don't quite understand in the 1990s. And so in Bill Clinton's first term, environment is a issue for maybe 1 or 2% of people, but economic issues, again, take the main stage. Healthcare, unemployment, poverty, the budget. 1997, during some very tumultuous years in the Clinton presidency, crime and drugs again popped up, environment being a small issue. It becomes a bigger issue during George W. Bush's first term before 9/11. He had run on an education platform, so education was an issue, but so was religious and moral decline. He had run as an evangelical Christian. Dissatisfaction with government, drugs, crime, the economy were all more dominant issues. By 2005, George W. Bush had regained the presidency. The Iraq War started becoming increasingly unpopular, and people were still concerned about healthcare, unemployment, dissatisfaction with the government. You'll see healthcare pops up in the 90s as a top issue, and it never leaves again. By Barack Obama's first presidency, first term, this is the height of the Great Recession. The economy in general is drawing a lot of people's concern: unemployment, lack of money. The Iraq War, Obama was elected largely because he came to prominence as being an outspoken critic of the Iraq War before he was in national politics. So people are concerned about those. Environment made some people's issues, but that was it. By 2013, environment was still a tiny, tiny percentage of anybody's interests. Budget, economy in general, unemployment, dissatisfaction with government, healthcare were all issues for Obama's second term. Foreign policy largely took a back seat. So keep in mind, 2013, the past 12 years at this point the past 13 years had been 13 of the 14 hottest years on record. A thing that just increased in Donald Trump's first term. His first year, people's concerns were mostly civil rights, elections, dissatisfaction with government, the economy, unemployment, and healthcare. Some terrorism, some immigration, some national security. Before the pandemic hit in the United States this year, or at least before people began noticing its effects, government and poor leadership was by far the dominant issue. Unifying the country, immigration, and healthcare were other issues. Economy, environment, pollution, climate change, and race relations were bigger issues than they had been before. These are going to disappear as we move into the pandemic, and in their place, diseases and coronavirus take people's interests. International issues largely fall by the wayside. At the time of recording this, the most recent Gallup survey has government and poor leadership and coronavirus and disease and as the top two issues, followed by race relations, crime and violence, unifying the country, and healthcare. I guess economic problems as well. Environment, 3% of people responded that it was important or the most important problem facing the nation. Nevertheless, in that time period, we've gone from 3/5 of the population thinking that global warming is real to 2/3, a slight increase. A tinier increase in terms of people believing that it was caused by humans. From 5/9 to 3/5 of people beginning that climate change had already happened. And an increase of quite a few of the people that had already believed it before, now being more concerned than ever. Still hasn't broken 50%, but 4 out of 9 people think that global warming is a real issue and will be a real issue in our lifetime. essentially what we've seen is the middle dropping out. People that were believers are now much more concerned believers. And at the same time, skepticism has grown. But as with everything else in our politics, we have stopped believing the middle ground. Now, in some cases, that's a bad thing. Well, I'll let you assess whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing here for yourself. Okay, that's all I have for this video.